Have you ever heard about an experiment so insane you wonder how any scientist thought, yeah, this is a great idea? Well, history is packed with those. Experiments that started with big ambitions but ended in absolute disaster. We're not talking about movie scenes from The Fly or The Incredible Hulk. We're talking about real experiments done by real people who clearly skipped the chapter on what could possibly go wrong. And let's just say, the results were anything but a breakthrough. From psychological nightmares to government projects that sound straight out of a conspiracy forum, these are 15 top-secret experiments that went horribly wrong. Buckle up, because this gets dark. Number 15. The gender experiment. Science should never play God, but psychologist John Money didn't get the memo. His notorious gender experiment on a baby named Bruce Reimer is one of the darkest chapters in medical history. In 1965, Bruce suffered a botched circumcision that left him permanently damaged. Then came John, who saw the tragedy as an opportunity to prove his controversial theory, that gender identity is purely a social construct. The solution he had? Well, raise Bruce as a girl, surgically reassigning him and changing his name to Brenda. For years, Bruce, now Brenda, was forced into a female identity, enduring humiliating therapy sessions designed to reinforce his new gender. However, the experiment was a complete failure. Brenda never identified as a girl, experiencing severe depression and distress. At 14, Bruce learned the truth and transitioned back to male, renaming himself David. Tragically, the psychological trauma followed him for life. In 2004, at just 38 years old, he took his own life. We bet John is in a better place. Number 14. The Monster Study. Being an orphan during the Great Depression was already a rough hand to be dealt. But for 22 kids in Iowa, things got even worse when a researcher decided to use them as test subjects in an absolutely horrifying experiment. In 1939, speech therapist Mary Tudor Jacobs wanted to prove that stuttering wasn't genetic, it was a learned behavior. So she went to an orphanage and divided the kids into two groups. One group got positive reinforcement, lots of encouragement, praise, and support for their speech. The other group, they were repeatedly told they were stupid, slow, and destined to stutter forever. And guess what? It worked. Kids who never had speech issues before developed lifelong stutters just from being constantly criticized or berated. Some became so traumatized they barely spoke again. This so-called study was never aired, and Jacobs later admitted she regretted it. But the damage was done. Many of those kids carried that psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. This was a creepy experiment. Number 13. The hurricane seeding experiment. In 1947, scientists thought they could control hurricanes. Their grand plan? Fly a bomber into a storm and dump a massive load of dry ice into the eye of the hurricane to weaken it. Because, you know, what could possibly go wrong? The experiment, known as Project Cirrus, was run by General Electric Labs. When Hurricane King formed over Florida and started drifting out to sea, they saw the perfect opportunity to test their theory. A fleet of bombers flew into the storm and released their icy cargo. Then, the storm vanished. At first, they thought they had successfully killed it. But the next day, they realized the hurricane had suddenly changed direction and was now barreling straight toward Savannah, Georgia. What followed was $2 million in damage and 1 death. The public blamed the scientists for making the storm worse. Lawsuits were filed against GE, though they were later dropped when meteorologists argued the storm had already shifted course before the ice was released. Still, the experiment was quietly abandoned. The whole motive of this experiment is simple. Messing with Mother Nature isn't as easy as it looks. Number 12. The baby chimp experiment. In 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg had a wild idea. What if a chimpanzee was raised like a human baby? Would it learn to talk, act, and think like us? So naturally, he brought home a baby chimp named Gua to raise alongside his own infant son, Donald. At first, Gua seemed to be keeping up. She learned basic commands, mimicked human behavior, and even surpassed Donald in certain cognitive tasks. But then things got weird. Instead of Gua acting more human, Donald started acting more like a chimp, grunting, biting, and mimicking Gua's animalistic behaviors. Alarmed, Kellogg abruptly ended the experiment, sending Gua to a primate facility. But the damage was done. Donald, having spent crucial developmental years with a chimp sibling, exhibited lingering behavioral changes. The study, which was supposed to test nature versus nurture, instead proved one unsettling fact. If you raise a human like an animal, it will be an animal. Number 11. The LSD elephant experiment. No, this isn't the name of some underground punk band. This is the true story of scientists who thought the best way to study elephant mating behavior was by getting one absolutely high on LSD. Back in the 1960s, researchers were trying to understand must, a period of aggressive and unpredictable behavior in male elephants during mating season. But instead of, observing them like normal scientists, they figured the best way to study must be to force it, with acid. Because of course, that's logical. The unlucky test subject was Tusco, a 14-year-old Indian elephant. Instead of easing him into it, they injected him with 25 times the known hallucinogenic dose for a human, because apparently, math wasn't their strong suit. The results were catastrophic. Tusco immediately went into seizures. Panicked, the scientists pumped him full of other drugs, including a barbiturate used in lethal injections. Sadly, he didn't make it. Science has done a lot of good, but sometimes it's just pure stupidity in a lab coat. Number 10. High-dose radiation tests on prisoners. In the 1960s and 70s, U.S. researchers exposed prisoners to extreme radiation in a twisted experiment to test how much it would take to make them sterile. Why? To see if astronauts and atomic workers could handle radiation exposure, because prisoners were expendable test subjects. Inmates in Washington and Oregon were paid just $5 a month, with a $100 bonus and a forced vasectomy at the end, while their testicles were blasted with 400 rads of radiation, the equivalent of 2,400 chest X-rays. They were never told the true risks. Many suffered burns, sterility, and long-term health issues. The government eventually admitted wrongdoing, but justice came far too late. Some experiments are unethical. This one was outright inhumane. Number 9. The Guatemala syphilis experiment. In the 1940s, U.S. researchers deliberately infected more than 5,500 Guatemalans with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other STIs, all without their consent. Why? To test penicillin as a potential cure for sexually transmitted diseases among soldiers. Victims included prisoners, mental patients, and even children. Many were left untreated, suffering horrific outcomes. Some died. Others endured lifelong health complications. This horrifying experiment stayed hidden until 2010, when the U.S. government finally admitted the atrocity. President Obama even issued an apology, but no amount of words could undo the damage. This was not medicine, not research, just pure exploitation. It remains one of the most shameful moments in American medical history. Number 8. The drug trial that turned into a horror show. Signing up for a drug trial sounds like easy money, until something goes horribly wrong. In 2006, 6 healthy young men joined a clinical trial in London, thinking they were helping to develop a life-saving drug. Instead, they nearly died within minutes. The drug, called TGN-1412, was supposed to treat autoimmune diseases and leukemia. But the moment it entered their bloodstream, all hell broke loose. Within minutes, they felt cold, nauseous, and in excruciating pain. Then the swelling began, so extreme that their heads ballooned beyond recognition. The media later dubbed it the Elephant Man trial. Every single participant ended up in intensive care, with organs shutting down and blood being filtered through machines just to keep them alive. One man lost his fingers and toes, others suffered permanent memory loss and destroyed immune systems. They survived, but barely. And the kicker? The drug had been tested on monkeys before, with no issues. Turns out sometimes even science has no idea what it's doing. Number 7. Stubbins Firth and the Yellow Fever. Meet Stubbins Firth, a 19th century medical student who had one of the worst research methods ever. While studying yellow fever, he theorized that it wasn't contagious and decided to prove it by rubbing infected vomit into open wounds, smearing it in his eyes, breathing in its fumes, and yes, eating it. When that didn't work, he injected himself with infected fluids and even created a vomit sauna where he inhaled the fumes of boiling bile. Despite his stomach-turning efforts, he never got sick. He confidently concluded yellow fever wasn't contagious, totally missing the fact that it was actually spread by mosquitoes. So, after all that puke consumption, he proved absolutely nothing. Some experiments are groundbreaking. This one was just stomach churning. Number 6. The Milgram shock experiment. Would you torture someone just because someone told you to? Well, that's what psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to find out in 1963. Volunteers were told to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to a learner whenever they answered incorrectly. The catch? The shocks weren't real, but the participants believed they were, especially as the learner screamed in pain. Shockingly, 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts, even when the person on the other end begged for mercy or fell silent. Milgram's experiment proved that ordinary people will commit horrific acts if an authority figure orders them to, a chilling reality with echoes in history. To this day, it's one of the most unsettling insights into human nature ever uncovered. Number 5. The Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, millions watched as NASA's Challenger shuttle lifted off with teacher Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian astronaut, on board. Just 73 seconds later, disaster struck. The shuttle exploded mid-air, killing all 7 crew members. The cause? A faulty O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters, something engineers had warned about but were ignored. NASA, under pressure to meet deadlines, launched anyway, despite concerns that the cold weather would cause the O-ring to fail. The world watched in shock as the explosion played out on live television. It was a devastating lesson in cutting corners at the cost of human lives. NASA didn't launch another shuttle for 2 years while they scrambled to fix their fatal mistakes. Number 4. Unit 731. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 conducted some of the most horrific human experiments ever recorded, all in the name of biological warfare. Thousands of Chinese prisoners were subjected to vivisections without anesthesia, limb amputations, and biological weapons testing. Victims were deliberately infected with cholera, typhus, and plague, just to see how diseases spread. The worst part? After the war, the U.S. granted immunity to the scientists involved in exchange for their research. Many went on to have successful careers in medicine and business, never facing justice. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when science loses all morality. Number 3, the monkey gland transplant. Picture this. It's the 1920s, and the world's wealthiest men are lining up for a miracle procedure to achieve immortality. The secret ingredient? Monkey testicles. This bizarre experiment was the brainchild of Sergei Abramovich Voronov, a doctor who believed grafting monkey glands onto humans would stop aging. By the early 1930s, over 500 men had undergone the procedure, convinced they'd unlocked eternal youth. Spoiler alert, they did not. While some claimed to feel rejuvenated, most experienced severe complications because, surprise, splicing monkey DNA into humans is a terrible idea. Infections, organ rejection, and psychological distress were just the beginning. Worse, Voronoff's pseudoscience inspired other Frankenstein-like procedures in the years to follow. Today, his work is laughed at as a cautionary tale of scientific overreach. But at the time, people actually believed he had cracked the code to immortality. Turns out, the only thing he proved was how desperate people are to avoid getting old. Number 2. The man who gave Thomas Edison X-ray vision. X-rays revolutionized medicine, but the road to discovery was paved with human suffering, specifically, one man's. Clarence Daly, a dedicated assistant to Thomas Edison, was at the forefront of experimenting with X-ray technology in the 1890s. But here's the problem. No one knew just how lethal radiation exposure could be. Daly found out the hard way. Every single day, he exposed his bare hands to radiation, holding them in front of X-ray machines for hours to help Edison perfect his invention. Safety precautions? Non-existent. After all, they were chasing a scientific breakthrough. It didn't take long before his body started falling apart. Sores covered his hands, then his arms. His hair fell out. His fingers had to be amputated, then his entire left arm, and eventually his other arm. The damage was too great, and at just 39 years old, Daly died from radiation poisoning. Edison, deeply shaken, reportedly said, "Don't talk to me about X-rays, I'm afraid of them." Too little, too late, but this dude finally gets the stakes. Number 1. The world's first see-through frog. If you thought glow-in-the-dark fish were weird, get ready for see-through frogs. Scientists at Hiroshima University developed these eerie little amphibians so they could literally watch their internal organs in real time. No dissections needed. Sounds cool, right? Well, not if you're the frog. Instead of hopping peacefully in a pond, these translucent test subjects were poked, prodded, and injected with all sorts of experimental chemicals. Sure, it's all in the name of medicine, potentially advancing cancer research and genetic studies. But let's be real. If frogs had lawyers, they'd have a solid case. The goal was to monitor organ function over a lifetime, but for the frogs, that lifetime wasn't exactly comfortable. They still endured drug testing and mutations, just with the added bonus of being fully aware of every experiment performed on them. Animal testing is controversial for a reason, and while this was a step toward more humane research, it still left these poor frogs stuck in a living nightmare. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you very soon.